For 15 years, the trucks dumped their seized irrigation pumps beside Etta Marsh's shed. The drivers never charged her, and she never asked them to stop. The pile held Berkeley and Goulds and old Cornell units, even a PTO pump somebody's grandfather had parked behind a barn in 1987. Most of the county called it the junk pile. Roy Calloway, the farmer next door, called it a fire hazard. Etta called it inventory, and she had learned what to do with every one of them from a man who wasn't around anymore to explain it. The first truck came in the spring of 2009, and the driver looked almost ashamed as he backed a flatbed up to the low tin shed behind Etta's house. He lowered the tailgate and winched a seized Berkeley pump down onto the gravel with a chain. It was the same pump that had run a 40-acre cornfield for 11 years before the impeller locked solid, and the well started dropping sand. He figured it was worth more as scrap. Scrap iron was paying almost nothing that spring, so the math didn't work either way. Etta walked out in her overalls, grease still under her nails from the morning, and looked the pump over without asking what was wrong with it, just where he wanted to set it. The driver pointed at the bare ground beside the shed. She nodded once, and he left the pump there, climbed back in the truck, and drove off, without a handshake or a bill. That was the whole arrangement, and neither of them ever wrote it down. Etta rolled the Berkeley up onto a pair of wooden blocks, wiped the casing down with a rag, and went back inside without opening it that day or that month. She let it sit where he'd left it, the way you set a tool down when you know you'll need it, but not yet. Roy Calloway saw the whole thing from his fence line. He ran the farm due east of Etta's place, 200 acres of corn and beans, and a herd of Angus cows he'd built up over 30 years of early mornings. That evening he walked over with his hands in his pockets to stand looking at the single pump on its blocks and ask if she was planning to fix it. Etta leaned on the shed door and said she'd get to it. Roy kicked at the gravel and told her it was seized solid, that Calhoun's had new ones on the shelf for $800. She gave him the kind of smile that didn't argue back and said Calhoun's had it covered then. He shook his head and walked home, and he told the story at the feed store the next morning, so by noon most of Dry Fork had heard about Etta Marsh's junk pile. Dry Fork Valley ran on water the way a body runs on blood. The creek came down out of the hills along the eastern edge and fed a string of ponds and shallow wells that kept the corn and the beans alive through every August. Irrigation pumps were as common out there as fence posts, bolted into concrete pads beside the creek, or sunk down into well pits at the low end of every other field. When one quit, you pulled it and hauled it to Calhoun Pump and Supply in town, or you called a man who knew the bench. Etta's father had been that man for 3 counties, and she'd grown up watching him work, though nobody in Dry Fork had connected the daughter to the trade yet. They would, but it would take a dry year and a locked door in town before anybody in the valley saw what she'd been keeping out behind that shed. One Saturday, when Etta was 16, her father Dell pulled a seized Goulds pump onto the bench in the back of his shop and told her to come watch. The shop sat behind their house on the county road, a cinder block room that smelled like grease and hot metal, and the coffee Dell kept warm on a plate warmer all day long. He unbolted the casing and lifted the impeller out, a brass wheel, scarred with pockmarks where the water had eaten it away over the years. He held it up to the light so she could see the pits, and he told her that was cavitation. What happened when a pump ran dry and the water hammered it hollow from the inside. Most people heard the word seized and thought the pump was finished, he said. But seized didn't mean dead. It meant tired. He showed her the mechanical seal next, a small ceramic and rubber ring that sat just above the shaft and kept the water from creeping up into the bearings. The seal on this one had cracked, and the water had gotten through and rusted the shaft sleeve underneath until the whole thing locked up. Dell pressed the old impeller off with a hand puller and laid the worn shaft sleeve on the bench beside it. The sleeve was a cheap part made to take the wear, he explained, so the shaft itself didn't have to. You swapped the sleeve, the seal, the wear rings, and the impeller, and you put the pump back on the line for another 10 years. He said a seized pump wasn't dead. It was just waiting for somebody who knew which part had given up. Etta stood there until the light went orange in the window. She didn't say much, but she didn't leave either. Dell worked on through the evening, reassembling the Goulds with new parts he pulled from a drawer he'd labeled in pencil. When he flipped the switch, the pump caught and ran smooth and quiet, as a sewing machine. He wiped his hands on a rag and told her that most of the pumps people threw away hadn't died. They'd just been left alone too long by somebody who didn't know what to listen for. She didn't know it then, but she'd carry that line for the rest of her life. Dell went out on a service call in November of 2004 and didn't come home, the heart attack taking him in the cab of his truck at the end of a farm lane with his tools still in the back. Etta was 31. She kept the shop and the bench and the labeled drawers just as he'd left them. Over the years that followed, she kept the habit too, the one where you didn't throw away a tired machine, just because nobody around you could see what it still had left to give. By the third summer, there were 9 pumps, lined up on blocks beside the shed. By 2016, there were more than 30. They came in on flatbeds and stock trailers and once in the bed of a half-ton Chevy that a young farmer had backed down the lane with the tailgate roped shut. A Cornell, 2 more Berkeleys, a Drought with a cracked volute, a Goulds that a hailstorm had dented, and a long PTO trailer pump-off an estate sale where nobody bid on the equipment lot. The drivers dumped them and left, and Etta rolled each one onto blocks, wiped it down, and wrote it into a ledger she kept in the shop. The ledger was the part nobody saw. She logged every pump by brand and year, and what she guessed had failed, the impeller or the seal or the bearings or the shaft, the way a doctor might note a symptom before they'd open the patient up. She kept the shed dry and the pumps oiled against the rust, and she tagged the ones she thought would run again with a strip of blue tape and the ones that were only good for parts with red. The county saw a pile of dead iron. Etta saw a shelf, sorted and labeled and waiting. The county's opinion hardened into a kind of running joke. Roy told the junk pile story every chance he got, and the men at the feed store and the diner added their own versions, each one a little bigger and a little funnier than the last. Calhoun, who ran the pump dealer in town, laughed along with them good-naturedly when somebody brought it up. He'd sold Etta's father parts for 20 years, and he liked her fine, but he told Roy once that she was wasting good shed space on machines that weren't worth the cost of the seals. Etta never argued with any of them. She just kept writing in the ledger. She did rebuild one in the winter of 2018. It was a small Berkeley she thought would be the easiest to bring back. She tore it down on the bench, swapped the seal in the sleeve and the wear rings, pressed on a salvaged impeller she'd cleaned up on the wire wheel, and reset the clearance the way Dell had shown her. She bolted it to a tank and ran it dry for 20 minutes, and it held, quiet and steady, the way a pump should sound when nothing inside it's working too hard. Then she shut it off, wiped it down, and rolled it back onto its blocks, because there was no drought and no buyer and no reason in the world for anybody in Dry Fort to pay her for a rebuilt pump when Calhoun had new ones on the shelf. The knowledge was proven and worthless at the same time, and she left it there on the shelf the way she left everything else, waiting for the year it would matter. There were years in there when even Etta wondered a little. She'd be out at the shed on a cold evening, oiling a shaft or retaping a tag. She'd look at the row of pumps stretching back into the dark and think about what the county saw, which was a woman alone with a pile of dead iron and no use for any of it. Etta kept the farm going on her own, a few head of cattle and a garden in the hay she put up every summer, and she lived quiet the way her father had lived, going to town on Saturdays and sitting in the back at the diner, and never once explaining herself to anybody. The neighbors took that silence for stubbornness, and maybe some of it was, but most of it was just patience, the kind that doesn't need anybody else to understand it to keep going. She figured a pump would tell her when it was time, and until then she'd keep the rust off, and the ledger current and the bench ready. The following spring the rain quit. It quit the way it sometimes does in Dry Fork, not all at once, but in a slow, stubborn absence that stretched from March into April, and then into May. Fields went in dry, and the dust came up off the gravel roads in the afternoons. By June, the creek along the eastern edge had dropped to a brown thread, winding through mud flats that used to be under 2 feet of water. The ponds shrank to green scum and cracked clay, and the wells that nobody had thought about in years, started pulling air. The aquifer under Dry Fork had been thinning for a long time. It had been thinning under a lot of the plains, and when the water table dropped, the pumps lost their head. A centrifugal pump needs water pushing into it to work, and when the level fell below the intake, the impeller started spinning dry, grinding against nothing, running hot until the seal burned out or the impeller cracked. Farmers who had never opened a pump house in their lives were suddenly standing over dead Berkeleys and Goulds, listening to a motor hum with no water moving through the line. Not one of them knew what to do about it. Roy's pump went on a Tuesday in early July. He planted 200 acres of corn that spring. By the time the well quit, he had maybe 3 weeks of moisture in the ground before the crop started curling past the point of saving. He drove out to the pump house and found the Berkeley seized solid, the shaft too hot to touch. The seal melted into a ring of black rubber and cracked ceramic. Roy called Calhoun. Calhoun told him to bring it in, so he loaded it in the truck and hauled it to town and left it on the counter the way a man leaves a body at the hospital, hoping somebody could do something even though he already knew. The corn curled, and the beans went gray at the edges. Down at the feed store, the talk turned to hay running out, and cattle prices, and whether to liquidate the herds early before the whole valley went under. You could feel the worry tightening up the conversations the way a belt tightens when you've pulled it 1 notch too far. And underneath all of it was the same question that nobody wanted to say out loud. If the wells were dying and the creek was dry, where was the water going to come from to keep a field alive? Who in Dry Fork still knew how to get it moving again? The heat did what the dry ground couldn't do alone. A pump that runs hot warps its shaft, and a warped shaft eats the seal and the bearings in a matter of hours. A well that drops slowly on a Monday could kill a perfectly good Berkeley by Thursday if the farmer didn't catch it and shut the power off. Most of them didn't catch it because most of them had never had to, and by the time they walked down to the pump house and smelled the burnt rubber, it was already too late. The valley was losing pumps faster than it was losing water, and the two losses fed each other in a circle that tightened every day. The rain held off. Calhoun Pump and Supply locked its doors in the 3rd week of July. It didn't go out with a collapse or a foreclosure notice on the door, just a hand-lettered sign in the window that said closed until further notice and a row of empty shelves visible through the glass. The parts had been thinning out for 2 seasons, the seals and the impellers and the wear rings, coming in late or not at all. The margins on what did arrive had gotten so narrow that a man couldn't keep the lights on selling them one at a time. Calhoun had hung on longer than made sense, and when he finally quit, he quit the way a lot of small rural businesses quit, quietly, with the inventory gone before the sign went up. The county heard immediately. Roy heard it at the diner from a man who'd heard it from the woman at the bank, and by that afternoon, the parking lot at the co-op was full of farmers standing around their trucks trying to figure out what came next. A couple of them drove 2 counties over to the next dealer, and they came back empty because that dealer was running on the same thin supply. There were no new pumps to be had, no seals, no impellers, and nobody left in the valley who rebuilt the old ones for a living. The crisis had started as weather, a dry year, the kind of thing a man waits out. With the dealer gone, it turned into something structural, a crack in the wall that wasn't going to close up when the rains came back. Etta stood in the door of her shed that evening and looked across the gravel at the row of pumps on their blocks, the ones the whole county had laughed at for 15 years. She didn't say a word to anybody about what she was thinking. Etta went back inside. She pulled the ledger off the shelf and set it open on the bench under the light, and the blue-taped pumps were still there, the ones she'd tagged years ago as the runners, and she counted them twice with her finger on the page. There were 19 she was sure she could bring back, and 4 more that might go with the parts off the red-taped ones. In a year with a working dealer and a full creek, that number wouldn't have meant anything to anyone. In this year, with the wells dying, the doors locked in town, it was the only number in Dry Fork that still added up to water. She lit the bench light that night and left it on for weeks. Etta pulled the first blue-taped Berkeley onto the vise, the same kind of pump that sat in half the pump houses in the valley, and went to work the way Dell had taught her. Slow and in order. She drained the casing and uncoupled the motor, withdrew the rotating element, and laid the impeller and the shaft and the seal out on a cloth in the order they'd come apart. How? The order you take a pump apart in is the order you put it back together in, and a man who forgets that has to learn it twice. The impeller was pitted, but not cracked. It was damage you could clean up on the wire wheel if you were patient. The mechanical seal was gone, the way they always were on a pump that had run dry, and the shaft sleeve underneath had rusted to the shaft, so she had to soak it in penetrating oil overnight before the puller would budge it. In the morning, she pressed the old sleeve off and cleaned the shaft. She laid out the new part she'd been saving in Dell's labeled drawers, the seals and the sleeves, and the wear rings she'd bought a few at a time over the years when Calhoun still stocked them. She put the pump back together with new gaskets, reset the impeller clearance with a feeler gauge, and bolted it to the test tank. It ran for 10 minutes and seized again. She stood there listening to the motor grind down and the water stop, and she didn't curse and she didn't quit. She just pulled the casing back off and went looking for what she'd missed. The seal she'd reused off another pump had a score mark she'd talked herself past the night before, a tiny groove that let the water creep up the shaft and wash the grease out of the bearing. Etta tore it back down, replaced the seal with a new one instead of the one she'd tried to save, reassembled the whole head, and ran it again. This time it held quiet and steady for an hour, then 2, the water cycling clean through the tank with no heat and no noise. She shut it off and wrote the result in the ledger in pencil, the way Dell would have, and moved on to the next one. She saved the PTO trailer pump for last. It was the one that mattered most, because the wells were dying, and you couldn't fix a dry well with a rebuilt pump. What you could do was pull water off a pond, or the last trickle in the creek, if you had a pump that moved a lot of water at low pressure and ran off a tractor shaft instead of a wall outlet. The PTO pump was built for exactly that, high volume and low lift, the kind of old iron that had kept fields alive through dry years since before anybody in Dry Fork was born. She cleaned it, rebuilt it, and ran it against the tank until she was sure, and then she rolled it to the shed door and waited for the man she knew would come first. The bench became the center of the place that summer. She ate at the workbench most nights, a plate balanced on a corner of the ledger, and she slept in the chair in the back when the testing ran past midnight. The shop smelled the way it had smelled when Dell was alive, grease and hot metal and coffee, and sometimes she'd reach for a part in a drawer and find his pencil labels faded down to ghosts and have to rewrite them in her own hand. Etta rebuilt 4 pumps and tested them and lined them up by the shed door before the first truck ever came down the lane. 4 machines the county had thrown away, sitting there clean and tight and ready to run. She didn't know yet how many fields they'd cover, but she knew they'd cover some, and after 15 years of waiting, that was enough to keep the light on. Roy came on a Friday hat in his hand. He was the same man who'd laughed at the junk pile from his fence line for 15 years. His corn had maybe 4 days left in it before the curling got passed. Saving his well pump was burned out and sitting on Calhoun's empty counter, and there was no dealer left in the valley to sell him a new one. He'd heard a rumor at the co-op that Etta had something running out at the shed, and he drove over with his truck empty and his pride about used up, and he stood in the gravel and didn't say much at all. Etta didn't gloat, and she didn't make him ask twice. She walked him to the front of the shed where the rebuilt PTO pump sat on a pallet, showed him how to set it in his pond with the intake dropped below the surface, and told him to run the shaft off the back of his tractor at 540 revolutions per minute. Etta talked him through the discharge, and the head, and the kind of pipe he'd need to get the water across to the field. And she did it the way her father would have, plain and short, no more words than the job required. Roy listened with his arms folded and his jaw tight, and when she finished, he asked her what she wanted for it. She told him a price that was fair, and not a cent more, and he nodded, and they loaded it on his truck with a chain and a ramp. The pond was lower than either of them hoped. Roy backed the tractor down to the bank and set the pump in at the edge where the water was deepest, and for a long minute the intake sucked mud and the discharge coughed and spat, and nothing clean came through. He looked at Etta, and she looked at the water, and neither of them said a word. Just stood there while the pump gulped and struggled and almost quit. Then the intake found the channel where the water still ran deep, and the discharge caught, and a solid stream of brown creek water hit the ditch and started running down the road toward the corn. Roy stood by the ditch and watched it go. He called that pump a fire hazard and a junk pile and a waste of good shed space. And now it was the only thing between him and 200 acres of dead corn. He looked over at Etta and opened his mouth and closed it again, and what came out finally was quiet, short. Just that he'd been wrong about the shed, and he was glad she'd kept all of it. Etta watched the water run down the furrow and told him the pumps weren't junk, they were just tired, and that was a line her father had given her a long time ago, come home at last. The county heard about Roy's corn by Sunday. The news moved the way it always does in Dry Fork, and by Monday morning there was a line of trucks back down Etta's lane before the sun was over the hills. Farmers who had laughed at the junk pile for 15 years stood in the gravel with their caps in their hands and their wells dead. One by one, Etta walked them through what she had on the blocks and what she could rebuild from the parts in the red-taped pile. She worked the bench 12 and 14 hours a day, tearing down and reassembling and testing. The pumps went out the gate on flatbeds and trailers to fields all across Dry Fork. By the end of that month, there wasn't a working irrigation pump for sale anywhere in the valley. Every one of them had come out of Etta's shed. The rebuilt Berkeleys went into the well pits where the water table had dropped, just enough to need a fresh seal and a tighter impeller, and the PTO pumps went to the ponds, and the slow creek, pulling surface water to fields the well pumps couldn't reach anymore. She'd sit on the bench at night with the ledger open, crossing off the pumps as they went out, and writing down who'd taken which one. The page that had been a joke for 15 years became the only inventory of running water in the county. By August, the line of trucks at dawn had become a part of the landscape, the same way the creek used to be, and the men who waited in them had stopped laughing about the shed a long time before. She could have charged anything she wanted, and she knew it. The men in line knew it too. She didn't charge a fortune, but she wasn't running a charity either, and the price she set was enough to keep the bench lit and the parts bought and her own land paid for through a year when most of the valley was bleeding money. There was a weight to it that nobody talked about, the quiet unease of a whole stretch of country depending on one woman and one shed, and the things a dead father had taught her on a Saturday when she was 16. The neighbors who'd mocked her needed her now, and needing somebody you've laughed at is its own kind of trouble, the sort that doesn't show up on a ledger but sits in a room anyway. Dell's knowledge had survived in the labeled drawers and in her hands. Now it was keeping the valley in water through the worst dry year anybody could remember. The inheritance had come home the way inheritances do when you don't throw away the thing the dead left you, not as money, but as the kind of worth that only shows up the day the ground decides to test it. Etta didn't say any of that out loud because she wasn't the kind to explain what she'd done, but the corn stood green in the fields around Dry Fork that August, and the corn said it for her. The shed sits quiet now at dusk. The bench light is off, and the ledger sits closed on the shelf where it always was. One pump is still left on the blocks in the back, blue-taped, and waiting for the next dry year, because Etta learned a long time ago that a tired machine isn't junk, it's just early. If you've got a story like this one sitting out behind your barn, you're in the right place, so subscribe to Rust and Roots and we'll keep telling them.